I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered around Australia. As this is a Zoom event, we are on different lands across the country. I'm personally on the land of the Barramadigal people of the Darug Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that all of us here in Australia live and work on unceded land. We are all on stolen land. And as the conversation that I just had with Julian highlights, it's not just a matter of taking land and being on unceded land. We have also done an enormous amount of harm in the time that we have had on this land too. Thank you everyone for joining us for this very important event marking 20 years since the Tampa rescued more than 400 refugees and asylum seekers at sea and was denied access to Australian territory. That event was a turning point in Australian history and really changed the way that we dealt with refugees and asylum seekers. Unfortunately, as we've recently seen in our response to Afghanistan, we are not very different to the people that we were in 2001. My name is Azada Dastiari, and I'm one of the directors of the Network for Law and Human Rights in the School of Law at Western Sydney University. The network is an academic group based at the School of Law and utilises high quality and high impact human rights law research to advocate against inequality and injustice. We aim to be led by those whose lives are affected by human rights violations. I encourage you to look at our website, which hopefully you can see behind me. Address is here, and to sign on to our mailing list to hear about future events and to be involved in our activities. It is my great honour to introduce the chair for tonight's event, the incomparable David Marr. David is widely regarded as one of Australia's most influential commentators, writing on subjects such as politics, human rights, censorship, the media, and the arts. David is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and has written for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the Saturday Paper, The Guardian, The Monthly. He has been an editor of the National Times, a reporter for Four Corners. He's presented ABC TV's Media Watch. His books include Patrick White, A Life, The High Price of Heaven, Panic, and many best-selling quarterly essays like his Master's Voice, Power Trip, Political Animal, The Prince, Faction Man, and The White Queen. On a personal note, it was David's book, Dark Victory, written with Marianne Wilkinson, that really opened my eyes to the horrors of Australia's extraterritorial refugee policies. That book led me to spend many years writing and researching Australia's treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, so I personally owe a lot to David. I, along with many others, also owe much to our extraordinary panellists tonight, who continue to inspire us with their dedication to the rights of the vulnerable, their fight for justice, and their commitment to exposing the cruelties of our current system. We hope to have time for questions tonight. So if you would like to ask the panel anything, please type your questions in the Q&A function and we will pass them on to our panelists. Please welcome David Marr, who will introduce tonight's speakers. Thank you, David.
Azada, thank you. You embarrass me. The shorthand way of getting through that huge list is to say, I'm old and I've been around for a long time and I suppose I've done a bit, but thank you. It's very, very flattering. Because we work not knowing whether any good comes of it, but to hear it got you going on the refugee law is thrilling. Thank you. This webinar tonight is celebrating, though that is just not the word, commemorating, marking the events of 20 years ago, which in a turbulent fortnight became known by the shorthand around the world as the Tampa. These were the events, as you said, where Australia took a remarkable, dangerous decision, which is that it was going to deny, firstly rescue, but then it was compelled finally to rescue after leaving an overloaded little fishing boat out in a storm for 18 hours, compelled at last to rescue the Palapa, the people on the Palapa, and then to deny them the right to land in Australia. And those events are with us still. They still shape our politics, they shape our law, and they shape very much the world's perception of this country. We have a panel tonight which simply perfectly places a foot in every area of concern from the Tampa. First, we have Abbas Nazari, who was a 7-year-old boy climbing up the ladder onto the Tampa, and he'll talk about that in a moment. Then we have grey-headed Julian Burnside, who was the leading lawyer in a fight to save the Tampa refugees from being sent to prison on Nauru, a fight that failed, but in failing, brilliantly laid out the legal and moral issues that were at stake in the Tampa. And we will be joined later by Behrouz Bouchani, the victim of the continuing Australian politics of border protection, as it is called. For Behrouz was a prisoner in the control of the Australians on Manus Island for over 4 years. And he has triumphed over them, his prisoners, and those who wished him imprisoned, by writing an extraordinarily fine book, which has won just about every literary prize in Australia, No Friend But the Mountain. But first we will hear from Abbas, who is also a writer, and I hold up his book, After the Tampa, and you will hear from the moment he opens his mouth a measure of what this country has lost. Just listen to his accent. Abbas.
Wow. What an introduction, David. Look, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Firstly, thank you, Az and WSU, for hosting this most timely and pertinent event. You know, it seems to be in the introductions that books are the topic, and currently my phone is literally stacked up on top of a number of books. Dark Victory by David Ma, Asylum by Boat, Claire Higgins, Refugee Rights and Policy Wrongs, Jane McAdams and Fiona Chong. So really, really, you know, standing there on the shoulders of so many others who've worked so tirelessly in this area, and my own, which came out this week, After the Tampa. Over the course of the next hour or so, you're going to hear from folks who experience the Tampa from a different angle, be it on the legislative side, be it being imprisoned on Nauru and later Manus Island, or covering it from the Australian mainland. My perspective, my experience was having been on the boat myself. So that's the angle and that's the perspective I'll provide, and you guys can piece it all together. And if you want, you can check out the book as well. Look, I was a 7-year-old. We lived in a beautiful village in the mountains of Ghazni, at the tail end of the Hindu Kush range there in eastern Afghanistan, 2,000 meters above sea level. We lived a basic and very, I would say, almost primitive lifestyle, but idyllic. Our village was in the highlands, in the central highlands there. There's a beautiful stream that ran through it. Our existence was very much subsistence living, you know, living off the land. It was incredibly harsh. It was man versus the elements. But by and large, our community of 3,000 odd Hazaras were, you know, we lived a good organic lifestyle. And then the Taliban came. I was born the same year the Taliban came through in 1994 in Kandahar. And 2 years later, they overtook Kabul, just as they have in the last couple of weeks. We could have left then, but we waited out because we didn't want to leave. We waited and we waited, hoping and praying that perhaps they would lose, they would leave, and we could resume our lifestyle. In fact, we were one of the last ones in our village to leave, mostly because we didn't want to. We wanted to resume our lifestyle that we had. We wanted to resume and live life normally. But in 2001, when the Taliban controlled close to 90% of the country, when they when they had continued for years their barbaric, their medieval reign of tyranny, which you all are very, very familiar with, that's when we decided it was no longer safe. They had overrun the cities, and that violence and the economic decline and the real threat to our lives, being an ethnic minority, was incredibly close. Dad was a truck driver. He used to drive around the provinces and he would bring news, and he would see, and that was our only connection to the world. And he would see how in Mazar-e-Sharif, for example, 1997 and 98, the Taliban essentially went street to street, door to door, and massacred Hazaras. And every town and every village had a story like that. And so he realized it was no longer safe for us. And that answers one of the first questions that people have. Why did you leave? What was the fear that was driving you? And right now, sadly, despite some of the talk and some of the rhetoric and some of the statements coming in from this new Taliban regime, it looks like, sadly, it will go back to how things were in the 90s. So we crossed the border into Pakistan. You can read the details in the book. And it was at that point that we had to decide what to do, where to go from here. And that is a juncture in the road that so many families face. You know, I say it's not like a vaccine rollout where you can just kind of wait in line for the queue and hopefully there'll be some vaccines left for you. There is no queue, there is no system, there is no way that you can just hopefully, you know, file your application and maybe you might reach the Norway or the Canada out tray. You know, there are some folks who live in refugee camps for years, decades even. And so in 2001, the alternative, either go back, stay in a tent, or go for that final slim chance at a new life. And that was going to be to jump on a boat to Australia. And that's what we did. We got onto this wooden, you know, rickety fishing boat, climbed aboard, middle of the night, incredibly overcrowded. And 18 hours, close to 24 hours later, we were dead in the water. I detail in the book, the horrors, the absolute fear and desperation that that gripped us, and how we knew that perhaps this was it. In fact, one of the chapters that I find incredibly hard to write about was the night of the storm, when we were caught in a raging torrent. And it reached the point, a lot of people ask me, Boss, what do you remember about that journey? And the memory that sticks with me the most, the memory that was so vivid, you know, it's like high definition in my memory, is the night of the storm, when we were being thrown around in this wooden fishing boat. And one dad grips onto his child and says, prays to himself, ushers a prayer under his breath, you know, oh God, if we were to drown tonight, then please let our bodies wash ashore so we can be buried on land. And I have that quote for quote verbatim in the book. But as you know, we survived. We were lucky enough to survive injuries, but no one was killed that night. And the next morning, we wake up, and in the late afternoon, piercing the horizon was the Tampa. And the rest is history. I'd like to finish off my piece in the last minute here to say we were one of the lucky ones to be resettled to New Zealand, to be given a chance at a better life. Helen Clark, in a bid to broker and break through the stalemate that the Australian government had enacted, said that, look, we will take about 150 of you, prioritizing men, women, and children, those in family units. And luckily, for me, that included myself. So while Bearus and some of the others will speak about having spent years on Nauru, I spent half a day on Nauru on the airstrip before a New Zealand charter plane came and took us to Auckland. And life for us began. We were resettled to New Zealand, to Christchurch in the South Island, where I'm speaking to you from right now. And the last 20 years have gone by incredibly quick. There have been incredible challenges, learning the language, getting accustomed to the culture and to the traditions, getting a financial base, learning how to network and build a community for yourself. All of that I detail in the book, and I detail it not so much to give you a sense of what it's like to pack your life up and go to a country that initially didn't want you, and so you arrive on the shores of another country that you had no preparation for. The emotional baggage, the mental trauma, the adversity, but also the resilience and the community that you build along the way. And now 20 years later, it almost looks like Afghanistan has come back full circle to the point that we left. And we'll touch on that later on throughout this discussion. But that's my piece. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll pass it on.
Abbas, thank you very much. We'll be back. Julian Burnside was one of the most sought after commercial lawyers in Australia. If you had a really technical, hugely expensive financial problem on your hands that you wanted to fight through the courts, Burnside was your man. And then, I'm slightly simplifying the story, and then the Tampa came along. And in those weeks, through his work, he became known to everybody in Australia. Some politicians were a little unhappy about it. Many people hugely admiring of the man ever since for what he did in the Tampa time to bring sense and decency to that crisis. Julian has been honoured in all kinds of ways. He's apparently a national living treasure, but he's also, quite quietly, one of the great benefactors of the arts in Australia. And he continues to fight for wonderful causes, and in particular for the cause of refugees. Julian.
Thank you, David. That's a very generous introduction. I had no idea you were going to talk like that, but I do want to start by talking about the really important books that have been written about Tampa. First, Dark Victory, which you wrote with Marion Wilkinson. And it is spectacular. The level of detail it goes into is remarkable. The second is Abbas's book, which I also have here, After the Tampa. I've got Dark Victory, by the way. Just so I'm not picking favourites. And Behrouz Boochani, who will be joining us later, has also written a book, No Friend But the Mountain. Behrouz has the rare distinction of having spent years on Manus as part of the compulsory offshore processing of asylum seekers in Australia. The court case that I was involved in relation to Tampa is really a tiny fragment when you consider it alongside the content of those books. The interesting thing, which I only, well, it's interesting that none of us lawyers had any contact with any of our clients on the Tampa, the people rescued by the Tampa. There was no contact between those people and the lawyers. And to be candid, when I was asked to do the case, I had no idea about refugee law or policy or Australia's attitudes because I was busy doing all of those cases that you mentioned. So what my role was seeking to establish the legality of what was going on. And the reason I took the case was odd. I mean, we'd only seen the photograph, which is behind Azadeh. That photograph had been published a bit, and ever since childhood, I've suffered from the heat a lot. And the only footage we saw of the Tampa, of the people rescued by Tampa, were these people sitting on the steel decks of a ship in the tropical sun. And I thought, geez, that's awful. That's really, must be terrible. And my concern was to get them out of that very awkward, very difficult, uncomfortable position. So no wonder my role was relatively minor compared to the account of global politics, which is in your book, David, and the account of what actually happened on the Tampa, which Abbas's book talks about. What I did not realize at the time was how many of the people rescued by the Tampa were from Afghanistan. I mean, we sort of had an idea that that was the case, but it wasn't clear. And it's interesting that in Justice North's judgment, Tony North's judgment, there is no reference to the fact of them being Hazara. The fact of Afghanistan and the fate of Hazaras in Afghanistan has come full circle. It's a very, as Abbas mentioned, it's a very, very uncomfortable fact, and something which I've been increasingly aware of. What I did not realise until later, after doing the Tampa case, was that the Hazara are generally visually distinctive because they have high cheekbones and Asiatic eyes, because they are thought to be descendants of Genghis Khan. When they first arrived in the country which is now called Afghanistan, they were Buddhists, and in fact they constructed the great Buddha statues at Bamiyan. After a while, and I don't know how long it was, Hazaras converted Islam, but they chose Shia Islam instead of Sunni. And of course the Taliban are mostly Sunni Muslims. That has had very bad consequences. It's like the position used to be when there was a huge argument between Roman Catholics and Protestants. That marred the 16th century and 17th century in Britain, and it emerged again fairly recently in the trouble in Ireland. In any event, the Taliban have taken the hatred of Hazaras to unprecedented levels. As we have all noticed in recent times with the sudden takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, the way they have treated Hazaras is appalling, and the way, I mean, most recent Afghan refugees in Australia have been Hazara, mainly because of their treatment was so bad. And one thing Abbas did not mention, perhaps because he was only 7 at the time, in March, I think, of 2001, the Taliban destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas. They attacked the statues which the Hazara had created centuries earlier. I think it's probably a good thing as a day that this is being held on the 30th of August, because that is that means that it is exactly 20 years ago today that the Norwegian ambassador boarded the Tampa, and I think he was the source of knowledge outside that most of the people rescued by Tampa were seeking asylum in Australia. That fact had been kept quiet because it was inconvenient for Australia to know that the people on Tampa were seeking asylum in Australia. In any event, the 30th of August 2001 was the first time we went to court in relation to the people rescued by Tampa, and the trial itself began on Sunday the 2nd, I think, Sunday the 2nd of September. It certainly was very, very soon after we first went to court. And what is not widely noticed is that we actually won at trial. The reason that it was not widely noticed is that in the newspapers the next day, all the news was about the terror attack on America, because the judgment of Justice North in the Tampa case was handed down at 2:15 in the afternoon Melbourne time on the 11th of September 2001. Not surprisingly, the fate of a case in the federal court in Australia took I was going to say second place, so fifth place after the terror attack in America, which happened just a few hours after the judgment in the federal court. The successful court decision, a decision based on habeas corpus, that is to say, let these people be free. That decision was overturned less than a week later by the full federal court by a majority of 2-1. It does make you wonder, what is Australia about? And this is a question I asked David before we started this evening, is Australia actually a place which would again act in relation to rescued people the way it acted in relation to the Afghans rescued by the Tampa, or would we take a more humane attitude? Unfortunately, I fear that we might behave badly again. It was very interesting that even though the Sri Lankan family from Biloela in Queensland got great support from the Australian community, when they were moved from Christmas Island, which had been reopened specifically to accommodate them at vast taxpayer expense, the fact that they were removed was they were sent over to Perth, and there was a press release by the present Immigration Minister Alex Hawke. In the final paragraph of his press release, he refers to people who come illegally to Australia. Illegals is one of the great lies on which the government has succeeded in its attitude. The fact is that people who come to Australia, including the people rescued by Tampa, commit no offence under Australian law by arriving here without permission or without a visa. They do not commit any offence. They are not illegal in any sense. So the question then is, are we a country which voluntarily, knowingly, locks up innocent human beings without trial and without any concern that they are not illegal? We keep calling them illegal, but it's a really interesting question whether that is because the press do not notice the fact that it isn't illegal. When I say the press, I don't mean papers like The Guardian, which David writes for. I mean the Murdoch press, where most Australians get their news. The fact is that most Australians seem to be blissfully unaware of the fact that it is a lie to say that asylum seekers are illegal. It's a lie to say that people who come here as refugees, as boat people, are illegal. And what is not widely known is that until boat people stopped arriving here because of the Pacific Solution and its aftermath, someone did some numbers. They worked out that if every boat person who arrived in Australia was handed $1 million in cash and ordered to go somewhere else to spend it, we would have saved money. It would have been terrible policy, but it's a very interesting reflection on how much we have spent as a country trying to keep this country to ourselves, a country which we stole from the people who had lived here for 60,000 years. We took it from them a couple of hundred years ago, and yet we say no one else should come to this country unless we approve of their arrival rate. So it's an interesting question to reflect on. Do we really want to be like this as a country, or should we perhaps open our hearts just a little bit for people whose living circumstances are incredibly difficult? It's interesting to reflect on the fact that there are in the world 70 million refugees, but that's a world with 7,000 million people. Now, it follows from that if every country in the world agreed and took their per capita share of refugees, every country in the world would increase its population by about 1%. That mightn't be such a bad thing to do. It would show that as human beings, we are in fact worth being called human beings. I hope we can manage that one day before we all wipe ourselves out with climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. turn off. You now mute.
No, I can't.
Ah,
Much better. Go ahead, David.
Oh,
Julian, just mute yourself. Better.
that's
Go ahead,
fantastic.
David.
That stops the interference, Julian, but you can still hear us, can't you? Yes,
Good.
marvelous. Our third speaker tonight is Behrouz Bouchani. Behrouz was taken by the Australians and imprisoned in New Guinea for 6 years. Most of that time he spent on Manus Island. To say that he has triumphed over his imprisoners is putting it mildly. Behrouz is now a journalist who is published around the world, and in particular by the organisation I work for, The Guardian. And his book, No Friend But the Mountain, has won nearly every literary prize that is available in Australia. It is beautiful, grim, funny at times, funny in the grimmest imaginable way, a work of great wisdom. And once again, in Australia's profligate way of throwing away talent, we decided we wouldn't take a bus because, God knows, we've got too many people on Fulbright scholarships at Georgetown University, just too many of them. And we've got too many writers as well, so we don't need Behrouz. And therefore, Behrouz also is now living in New Zealand. Behrouz, welcome. But we can't hear you. I think you're on.
Yeah. Hello, thank you very much for having me. I would like to say hello to everyone. It's very nice to see all of you, David, Julian, and Abbas. I and Abbas, we met each other in New Zealand in a cafe one day. I think it was last year. And when we met, I felt that, you know, two pieces of the Australian history get together, you know, met each other. And I look at it as actually as a puzzle, you know. And I should mention this, that you mentioned the book is funny. I think you are the second person who say that. 2 years ago, a comedian, Australian comedian, told me that this book is funny as well. So you are the second person, and I agree with you. Yeah, that is very interesting because I expected that people say this book is funny as well, but no one say that. So you are the second person who say that. It's very interesting. You know, I look at the whole policy towards the refugees as a puzzle. You know, once I wrote about this, that when they banished us to Manus Island, when we arrived there, I saw that there are other people, other refugees, some families who were there. And when we asked them that, how long you have been here? I was banished on 2013. They say that they sent us here on August 2012. And when we arrived there, after a week, they transferred them to Australia. So actually they replaced us with them. And after a while in the prison, I could see some signs inside the prison camp, some signatures, some drawing, some painting that the children created that draw on the wall, some poetry from woman, Iranian woman, other people. And when I did research about it, I found out that actually before, on 2001, there were refugees here. So it is not the first time they transfer people there. And I mean, that's why I say that after a while, I found out about Tampa ship. I found out about Tampa ship. And, you know, I think when I look at this, I look at this as a like a puzzle or as a rope towards a cave, which is the Australian history. And when you follow this rope in the cave, that actually it takes you to different places, into deep down to the history of Australia. And when we follow the 19 July policy, we reached to the refugees who were transferred to Manus and Nauru on 2012. Then when we followed that, we reached to the policy towards the refugees of 2001. And then when we followed that, we reached to Tampa ship. And when we followed that, we reached to the history of colonization in Australia, and the stolen generation. When we follow that, we reach to the white policy. I mean, that is my understanding of this. The whole this policy towards the refugees. So we cannot really understand it without understanding the history of colonization in Australia, history of these prison camps in the Australia, and without understanding of Australian mentality, towards the refugees and towards the marginalized people, towards the minorities in the society. When we really, if we just do research and follow this rope, that takes us to many places. And I think that is very important that we understand it. I have a question. Someone like Kevin Rudd, he apologized for, people with, you say, stolen generation. They officially, but they did it again, but in a different way and on a different group of people. You know what I mean? I mean, that always repeat itself in in Australia. That's why I think it's very important that we really understand this Tampa and how that impact on Australia, how that impact on Australian political culture. And the interesting thing is that when I arrived in New Zealand, sorry, I talk too much, I should mention this. When I arrived in New Zealand, I attended in an exhibition in Auckland, and someone came there and said that my father wants to talk with you. And I said, oh, I'm busy. But they forced me, they say, you must meet my father. My father, his story is same as your story. And when I met him, I found out that that man actually was in prison in Manus Island in 2001. Exactly the same story. And later I met Abbas. And later I was having lunch in a place in the Christchurch city. Someone approached me and he said that, are you Beirut? And I say, yes. And he said, oh, my story and your story is same. And I say, how? And he said that I am among those people who were deported. I mean, Kiwis who were deported from Australia. And he said, just they deported me here and my family are in Australia. And now I have been here for 6 months, I mean, when you look at all this story, it seems that each place, everywhere we go, we see some piece of this whole story. So that is, I find it very incredible. That's why I say that forever we chase Australia. We chase Australia because we are carrying our stories. Someone like Abbas, he was a kid and now he published this book, which is important. Abbas grew up and now he is chasing Australia. chasing Australia history and the politicians. Yeah. Thank you.
Behrouz, thank you. I have never heard it better put. I'll never get out of my mind the image of the rope in the cave. Perfect, a perfect description of this country. Have you been here yet? Have you been to Australia, Behrouz?
No, just I was in Christmas detention.
Oh, yes, yes, of course. But do you have a New Zealand passport? Is it?
No, I just actually apply. So hopefully in a year I get it. Yeah.
We look forward to seeing you here.
Actually, I don't want to visit Australia without publishing my next book.
Aha!
Yeah, because if I just visit Australia, the Australian government say that this guy used New Zealand as a backyard to come to Australia, you know. But if I publish my book, I said just I come here to see my readers.
Behrouz,
That's fantastic, Behrouz, because I've been living in New Zealand for 20 odd years, and I've transited through Melbourne, Tullamarine a couple of times, but I never actually gone to the country. So that whole backdoor policy just doesn't really sit well.
So if
Actually, I like to visit Australia just to see my friends.
that would be terrific. But I just want to reflect on Abbas's strange situation at the moment. He tried to come to Australia, so they sent him to Nauru, and he ended up in New Zealand. But his next visit to Australia, he will be addressing the press club in a week's time, and that address will be broadcast to the nation by the ABC. So it's another way of coming to Australia, Abbas, and a wonderful way to that. Now, I have a million questions, but I'm going to allow others to start first. But hey, can I just ask one thing of Abbas? Julian mentioned the situation of the Hazara in Afghanistan. And I think it was wonderful of him to do so, because I think this is not understood, that there is both a racial and a religious divide here that is being fought over. And I'm wondering if you could just sketch that out for us, because these are two different cultures, aren't they, that are butting up against each other.
That's right. That's right. And thanks for bringing that up, Julian. Look, I'll give you the 60-second rundown of it. Afghanistan, given its geography, is a very multi-ethnic and multilingual and multicultural place. Gradually over time and over space, that has meant that different religious movements and different ethnic groups have occupied it and battled for what is now modern day Afghanistan. My people, the Hazara, just to give you a little history lesson, there's origin stories differ depending on who you ask. And I know, looking at the 200 participants tonight, you'll all have your opinion about what that means. But the Hazara, the word itself comes from the word Hazar, which means 1,000. And the myth, the folklore, is that when Genghis Khan took over what is now Afghanistan, he left about 1,000 troops to occupy the place. And gradually those 1,000 Mongols interbred and married, and then as now, formed the Hazara group. So we look different, like you said, Asian features. We speak a different language. We speak Dari, which is a dialect of the Persian Farsi. I don't practice myself, but Hazaras generally tend to be Shia Muslims, which is a minority within Islam as opposed to Sunni Islam. So there is a religious and ethnic difference there. And when those two things overlap, and you've got a very large and very powerful Wahhabi fundamentalist movement in what is now the Taliban, that makes for a pretty deadly scene. And sadly, we saw that in the 90s. But again, just to wrap up my answer, the Taliban in the 90s actually continued a century of oppression against the Hazara. The most notable actually started in the 1890s when the first essence of Pashtun nationalism came through, and some sources suggest that the Hazara population of Afghanistan was decimated by up to 60%. And by the way, there's a 30-second version. I write about Hazara history in After the Tampa as well.
Yep. Thank you. And Julian, can I ask you a question, which is this? The Tampa is now 20 years ago. And in those 20 years, Australia has imprisoned refugees on Manus and on Nauru, and imprisoned refugees inside Australia. Why can't the High Court recognise that these people are prisoners, that they are prisoners being held without trial by administrative direction? What is it that has stopped the High Court? Have they lacked courage? Is this a cultural thing whereby the courts of Australia have tended to back what Behrooz was talking about, that dark history of race? Pretty simple. These people are prisoners. Why can't the court see it that way?
I really do not know. I don't know the right answer to that. I think the relevant provisions of the Migration Act are pretty tight, and they were, of course, inserted into the Act by the then Keating Labor government. They are held in detention, they can't get out. And of course, since the middle of 2013, we have been making it compulsory for anyone who arrives here by boat to be sent to either Nauru, if they're women or children or part of a family group, or to Manus if they're men on their own. And the simple fact is that they're treated like prisoners. You're right. Why they're not recognised as prisoners, I can't explain. But I'm sorry.
It's one of the great failings us to be unable to recognise.
Yeah. Sorry, your voice is very vague, David.
We're having not the best technical issues here. Look, can you hear me, Julian? Behrooz, Abbas?
I think what the problem is that every time Julian's mic is on, that's when the audio kicks off, but we can hear you fine, David.
You're a young person, Abbas. What's Julian's problem? Can
It
you
might just be, it might just be,
his problem for us?
it might be one of two things. If your phone is near your laptop, just maybe move it further away, or if just move your laptop if perhaps the speaker or the mic is being close to like a book or something, if it's muffled. That's the only two fixes.
We'll try those two things. I want to ask the whole panel to comment on this. On the language that surrounds Australia's operations against refugees, on this language of these new inventions of things like border protection, Pacific solution, the language that has grown up. What's your view of the way in which that operates? Abbas, start with you.
Oh man, language, that is an incredibly powerful tool in how this whole thing is talked about. In my book, I talk about how when we were on the Tampa, we might as well have been on another planet, because there was no names, there was no faces to our story. When the commentary about the Tampa was taking place, we were just a bunch of 400 nameless and faceless people out there in the ocean. So language is so incredibly important. And sadly, the way we were, put in a bubble that was disconnected from the world, it meant that everything could be said about us without our input. Looking at it from a New Zealand perspective, and I know we have our own issues here, so I don't want to, make us look like angels in Australia look like the devil, but looking at it from an outside perspective on what's happening, how this whole thing is talked about in Australia, it does seem to me that it's a lot more visceral. It's a lot more, I wouldn't say passionate, but it's just talked about in such an inhumane way. Whereas here, maybe because we're small, maybe because we're quite a team of 5 million, it just seems to be talked about in a much more humane manner. So that's, that's my 2 cents on language.
Behruz, do you think that it's talked about differently in New Zealand because of the Maori? Because race in New Zealand is a nuclear issue, isn't it?
I think so. New Zealand, if we talk about New Zealand, I think that is a different issue. So I would like to talk about it later if you give me this chance, that I compare New Zealand system and New Zealand policy towards the refugees with Australia. I like to talk about this later if you give me a chance, because it's important.
Why not now? Why not now?
Because now I like to talk about language.
Oh, right. Okay. First things first.
Yeah, because this language actually is very important, and I have been working on about language for many years. So in all of my works, I mean, with journalism works or the book or other works, even the movie, I really try to challenge the language, the official language in this context, the language which created by the power structure. That is my aim and was my aim, to challenge that language, because the government is able to justify this policy through the concepts and words which created. The government is able to justify this policy through language. The government is able to dehumanize the refugees through this language. And when you dehumanize the refugees, continue to this policy is easier. People already are. The government is able actually to normalize this systematic torture through language. And unfortunately, the media, that's why I criticize the media, is that the current journalism language is too problematic, because the current journalism language actually follow the language of the power structure, the language of propaganda, the language of the government. And it's not only about the refugees, it's about marginalized people, minorities, and that is a huge problem with the media. The media shouldn't actually use this official language. And that's why, in all of my works, I try, if I give you an example, you mentioned a very good thing, prison. I didn't name my book. The title of the book is Writing from Manu's Prison. And in all of my works, always I said Manu is, I didn't say I didn't say the official name, what they say it, they say it to Manu's Prison, the offshore processing center.
Yes.
I didn't say Pacific solution. I said exile policy. I call it exile policy. I call the prison or prison camp. I mean, all of these words are really important, that we should, that's why I say we should create our own language, our own perspective, our own concept to challenge that language. Because if we just follow the language of the government, actually we already lost, so for doing that, we don't have a chance. Just we should create our own language. And through our own language, we create our own discourse. We shouldn't let the government to run this discourse. We should create our own knowledge and discourse. And that's why I think language is very important in this context. And just we should think about it, that we don't use but unfortunately the media do that. Yeah, it's very difficult.
It's not just when talking about refugees.
Yeah.
The media does that when it's talking about global warming. It does that when it's talking about climate policy. It does that continuously. It simply accepts the new language that the government is putting out and becomes fluent in it and uses it all the time. You point to a persistent, very difficult problem. Very, very difficult problem with the press. Very difficult. A question for Julian now. Julian, can we expect any real help at all from international courts and international forums to solve the problems in Australia? Does Australia listen? Is Australia in any sense bound by any of the decisions of these bodies? Can even the UNHCR have any real impact on what Australia does?
I think the answer to that really is in what Behrouz has been speaking about. The problem in Australia is that most people get their news from the Murdoch press. The Murdoch press has never, ever denied the illegal tag or the other language that distorts the issue. We've had from the UNHCR a number of rulings about particular asylum seekers, rulings which criticise Australia, but you don't hear about those unless you're in the area. You don't hear about them in the mainstream media. And that's the problem with the press.
Julian, are you slipping into the same danger yourself? You just used the expression asylum seeker. They're refugees, aren't they?
Well, until they're assessed as refugees, they are called asylum seekers. And it's true that as soon as, if they're assessed as a refugee, they're a refugee all along. But I don't think asylum seeker is part of the misuse of language.
There used to be a hideous expression, genuine refugee. Remember that one? That's died away, genuine refugee.
Yeah, because I think the press would be disturbed to understand how many genuine refugees there are.
Do you really think most people get their news from the Murdoch press? I mean, the most trusted in survey after survey after survey after survey in Australia, the most trusted source of information is the ABC.
Have you ever heard the ABC contradict the idea that people seeking asylum are exercising a right rather than breaking the law? Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard the ABC?
They do.
Huh?
When I'm on it, they do.
Yeah, well, you need to get around a bit more.
Now, Behrouz has opened a subject which I think is very interesting for us to follow, which is to contrast the New Zealand and Australian situations as a way of illuminating the Australian situation. But Behrouz, can I come to you after first asking Abbas that question, how he feels about it, and then we'll come back to you. Abbas, how do you think that the thinking, the feeling of it differs?
Look, first and foremost, being a patriotic Kiwi, those two things don't go hand in hand. But sometimes there are points where I can kind of put my chest and shoulders out and be proud to call myself an Afghan New Zealander. There are many areas, rugby being one of them. But
yes, that's
so I'm wearing all black.
Issues, of course. Yes.
But one of the other areas is when it comes to having those most difficult of conversations, particularly to do with race, particularly to do with having a fair go. And I understand that the word fair go is very much part of the Australian lexicon. There's a great article written about, when you talk about the great democracies, every one of them has a linchpin. In America, they always yell about freedom. Whereas in New Zealand, it's more about equality, and trying to break that level of second citizenry, that everyone should be equal under the law and equal in opportunity as well. So we were, fortunate enough to have some fantastic advocates way back, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that pushed for Indigenous rights in New Zealand, and that was groundbreaking. And that started off, in the mid-80s. That finished off in the mid-80s with our, native land tribunals. And so that put us ahead, a few decades ahead of some of the other countries now that are finally picking up that trend. So that is one aspect of it. When it comes to discussing this, it's New Zealanders, and I'm not saying all of them, but New Zealand society generally, compared to Australia especially, is perhaps a little bit more open about having the conversation and having it in a more humane and nuanced way. Of course, I'm not saying that, oh yeah, we're all happy-go-lucky and everyone's on the same page. Of course not. There's a plethora of opinion, but the conversation can be had without turning into a fist fight. Whereas I feel perhaps that the appetite isn't so much across the ditch in Australia. Now, that doesn't mean that, we can pat ourselves on the back and say, job done. On a per capita basis, New Zealand actually accepts far less and far fewer refugees than most other developed countries. We're somewhere at the bottom of the list. And under this administration, under the Ardern administration, that has increased markedly. And we are waiting to hear with bated breath the government response to Afghanistan. And the fact that this government has been incredibly silent on that, it's glaringly obvious. But to wrap up my answer, I think we are generally open to having the conversation, a bit more so than perhaps Aussies.
One thing that I kept coming across when I was reading about New Zealand attitudes to refugees years ago, when Marion and I were writing Dark Victory, was this persistent claim that a steel-hulled boat was on the way to New Zealand. Australia could be reached by leaky tubs like you came on, and New Zealand, they would never get to New Zealand, but a steel-hulled boat was on the way, usually from Africa, so people would be as black as possible, and that this was a vehicle for fear of refugees. Do New Zealanders still talk about the steel-hulled boat that's on the way?
That's a fantastic point you raise up. I think given New Zealand's geography, we know that Australia is particularly, just much closer and much more, vulnerable to boats arriving. So we understand that we're further away. But you're right. I do remember, I think it was perhaps 2011, 2012, there was a boat, a wooden boat with Sri Lankan asylum seekers. And they had boats, they had a big sign saying, we want to go to New Zealand. And that made front page news here because they didn't have a steel-hulled boat. They just made their intentions clear because they knew that the road to Australia was closed. So that gave New Zealanders a scare, and it just kind of died away. But you're right, that conversation about, well, one day they'll have, these people smuggling rings will have steel-hulled boats and they'll get here. That's still kind of in the back minds of some people.
Yes. Behrooz, how do you see the difference in feeling and the difference in discussion around refugees between the two countries?
Yeah, I think first I should criticize New Zealand, then I go to...
Good, yes.
Before I criticize Australia, is that I think the huge problem in New Zealand is that still Australia, compared to the population, Australia accepts more refugees.
Yes.
So New Zealand only accepts 1,500 refugees per year. And just that happened just over the past I think 3-4 years that there was a campaign about it, and they have increased the number, but still is nothing compared to a country like Australia and other countries. And I think that is, as Abbas mentioned just on recent days about the Afghan refugees, New Zealand is too slow, and it's not. I think that is a huge problem in New Zealand. So still, we should give this credit to Australia rather than New Zealand, in terms of numbers. So that is a huge problem. But what is important in also New Zealand, I think I talk about the life experience of a refugee. That in Australia, the system which designed actually, so some of the refugees are in indefinite prison. So they are facing the system. So the system, I call it in Australia, systematic torture. They are in the system, they are in the prison. So they are suffering. But often people don't talk about those refugees who are in the community and they have different visas. People don't talk about them because people just think about those refugees who are in the detention, in the prison, and people forget about other people in the community. But that is very important. Those people who are free, we think they are free, and they are living in Melbourne, Sydney. They are in the community. Actually, the system chased them. They always feel the system every day, every moment. They feel the system, and the system always chase them. Sometimes send them letters, and they say, "Oh, we are going to deport you to Nauru. We are going to send you back to Manus. We are going to send you back to your country. We are going to send you back to the camp," or sometimes they just arrest them for a very small mistake and they send them to prison. So I mean that they always feel the system, they are free, but actually the system is there. But in New Zealand is different. In New Zealand, the process is clear. When you come to New Zealand, I mean, as a refugee, when you come to New Zealand, they give you work visa after a very short time. So you can go and work. But in Australia, most of the refugees don't have work visa, or their visas are just for 3 months or 6 months. In New Zealand, you have work visa. So you can go and work and just support yourself. You don't need the government actually. And also, you can do your work through your lawyer and you don't feel the system. I have been here for 2 years. Still, I should process my application, but I haven't feel the system. Never. No one asked me in the street or no one asked me, who are you? Give us this, give us this. They didn't send me any letter, nothing. I don't feel the system. So I feel freedom. That is very important. The refugees in Australia, they don't feel safe in front of the system. I mean, even those refugees who are in the community and even those refugees who are working, they have been in Australia for 8 years, 10 years. They don't feel safe in front of the system. But in New Zealand, you feel safe. You feel safe. You can get support from the government. You can always call them if you have problem, and they don't bother you. They don't torture you. They just that is so important. I think so important. And we should understand that how this is different, you know. For a refugee, sometimes getting a bank account is like a big gift. For us, having a bank account is very easy, simple thing. But for a refugee, is a big thing, you know. And I think that is very important. And another thing is different between Australia and New Zealand is that in New Zealand democracy, if you run a campaign and if you do it in the right way, I mean, advertise it well and get support from the public and do it in the right way, in a proper way, most of them you are able to achieve something, to create some change. The government respond to that. For example, Amnesty in New Zealand, they did a report about uh, some refugees who were in prison. The government responded to that. They had a meeting with them and they fixed it. The campaign has started to increase the number and people supported and the government responded to that. But in Australia, we have had many national campaigns, nothing changed. You know, look at Beulah family. Whole nation, whole country are demanding that just release them. They don't do. And it's very easy for them just by signature, you know? I mean, that is very different. That shows that democracy in Australia is broken. I don't know. I'm not in Australia. Something huge is wrong in that country.
That's fantastic, Behrooz. If I can just build on that, man, that temporary visas, those bridging visas that so many Afghan Australians particularly find themselves on, that is actually one of the demands that community activists in Australia are fighting so hard for. It's one of their #1 demands, and it's for 2 reasons. How can you build a life and certainty for your family in Australia or for yourself, or especially if you have family and relatives in Afghanistan, if you don't have the right to work or access social services? A lot of people think that just because these guys are here, that's it. Actually, and I'm speaking of mine and my own community here, we support, through remittances, we support up to 6 families in Iran and Afghanistan. So by giving those people in Australia permanent visas and permanent residency, what you then allow is some certainty for them to build their lives and also to support the rebuild in their home countries. And like Behrooz said, that can literally be done without bringing more people. It's just a signature from the Minister of Immigration to grant those visas. And I would hate to think that if I was a refugee in New Zealand, I would be a second-class citizen. I wouldn't be able to work. I'd always be chased around by the immigration department and be able to be deported at the drop of a hat. I mean, that is torture, death by 1,000 cuts.
But
can I say in relation to that, I think one of the problems which you're both touching on is that in Australia, very few people actually ever meet a refugee. Whereas in New Zealand, with a smaller population, I expect that refugees are an ordinary part of the community. And I have met hundreds of refugees in my time for obvious reasons. And I think it makes a big difference to the way you perceive them. Seeing them as human beings is a really important step, because I think Australians are mostly fairly concerned about human rights. I hope we are. And yet, if you don't recognise a particular group as human beings, well then an interest in human rights takes you nowhere. Interestingly, it was my wife, Kate, who made a big difference in my life in this respect. She was horrified by the Tampa episode and said immediately, look, most Australian homes have got a spare room. We should set up spare rooms for refugees. And so from late 2001 to the present, we've had refugees living at home with us. The very first one was a Uyghur from Xinjiang province in China. And it is amazing how much you learn about people just by spending time knowing refugees. I was in Hobart some years ago, and I ad-libbed a suggestion that maybe Tasmania, which should be declared a place of detention, the whole island. There is historical precedent for it.
Yes.
And I suggested that meant that all people who come to Australia as boat people would be able to go to Tasmania and live in the community, and maybe the Australian government could toss them $1 billion a year for their trouble. And that was welcomed especially by Lara Giddings, who was the then Premier of Tasmania. It was sneered at mostly by people who lived in the western suburbs of Sydney, who had probably never met a refugee in their life. So knowing refugees, meeting refugees makes a big difference to the way they are accepted. And I think if we're going to make a change in this country, we have to, well, I guess you have to change the language that's used. And the language is very important. And I suspect that in 20 or 25 years' time, if human beings still exist on this planet, we will probably have a royal commission into what was done from 1992 to the present. And people will go around horrified at the extraordinary abuses of human rights that we've engaged in by putting refugees in prisons, by forcing them into the community without the opportunity of working. These are things that are absolutely appalling.
Julian, you bring us to what may well be our last question, because time is flying. And to ask you all, 20 years down the track, what do you think is the inheritance of the Tampa? What do we live with now because of the Tampa? Behrouz.
I think political culture in Australia has been damaged. You know, I mean, Tampa, you know, after Tampa and how the government actually, they politicize the refugees issues and refugees matter. They politicize it, and that became like a very like a political tool for the government and both parties. And they have been using the refugees, you know, in all of the election, they use the refugees. And I think that impact on political culture as well. So we cannot say that only refugees became victim or damaged under this policy. You know, actually Australian people, Australian society paid cost, you know, too much cost for this policy, because these people, we should never forget this, Peter Dutton, he was one of the main people who were running Manus and Nauru, and in the same time he is running Australia as well. So you cannot expect that someone treat people, a group of people, in a, you know, abuse them, you know, torture them, and do all of this wrong thing, horrible thing, and in the same time treat Australian people in the right way. You know, actually, what I understand, I say that through my experience as someone in Manus Island. Still, I say everything through my experience in Manus Island, that this government, especially Liberal Party, has learned a lot from Manus, has learned a lot from Nauru, how to manipulate Australian people, how to play with people of Australia, how to actually, run the country, because I think that is very important. Unfortunately, in Australia, still mainstream media, or people really don't acknowledge this. We should think about this. The knowledge is in Manus and Nauru. The political knowledge, if we really want to understand this, like someone like Scott Morrison, probably we were the first people who found out that this guy is a populist guy. Because we became victim. They torture us. And later they came to other people in Australia to, I think that is important. This government has learned a lot. And it's not only about human rights, how to make money, how to be corrupt and don't answer, don't be accountable for that, how to be corrupt, how to play, how to be manipulative. It's not only to torture and, about human rights. I think that is very important. This policy has negatively impact on Australian political culture. That is very important. I believe that Australia became more, if we say that Australia is a dictatorship system, I think it's became more brutal because of Manus and Nauru.
Behrouz, I can't wait for you to get here.
Thank you. Sorry.
Julian, inheritance. What do you think what are the key things that we've inherited from the Tampa that are with us still?
That really depends on how long we have to tolerate the Murdoch press. Earlier, you said you didn't agree that most people get their news from the Murdoch press. I would love it if every Australian read The Guardian every day. If that's where they got their news from, or the ABC, that would be good. But I fear that given that the politicians strive more than anything for re-election, I fear that we will, for a long time, continue to do whatever they think will make them popular. And if they can become popular by misstating the facts, by abusing refugees, well, then they will do that. And they will misrepresent what they're doing in the press. Now, that is a real concern. I think
you see us as locked in.
I'm sorry?
You see us as locked in to that political entanglement.
I fear that we are, unless the next generation, who seem to be a little bit more enlightened about refugees, if they set up in due time a royal commission, then maybe things will change. Although I did think things would change after the royal commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, but that is not the way it worked out.
Now, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Abbas, what do you see as the inheritance?
Wow, what an incredible question. The inheritance of the Tampa 20 years on. First and foremost, what do Australians get? They get a bloody ripper of a book called After the Tampa by a bloke called Abbas Nazari, from Afghanistan to New Zealand, out now. That's what they get. But no, look, 20 years on from the Tampa, I think, sadly, many of your points are correct, Behrouz and Julian, that the needle hasn't moved much. It's moved incrementally. I fronted a World Vision campaign to get the kids off Nauru in 2018. And that was after years of campaigning, and was so glad to say that there are no children left on Nauru. But how incredibly energy sapping that was to finally get something as small as that. In my book, I write about in decades to come, when perhaps there is a commission of inquiry into offshore detention, when these open air prisons in the Pacific are closed, that everyone who was responsible will have passed away and no one will be held responsible for it. No one will serve punishment. And what Australia will have on their hands as the legacy of the Tampa is just dozens of people who have self-harmed, who have committed suicide, who have been killed at the hands of the state. And no one will be held responsible for that. I am forever optimistic that this chapter in Australian history will close. How long that might take, I can't be certain. But it's appalling. And to have a country like New Zealand right next door who has offered year after year to say, look, we will take some of those people off your hands. And that has been completely denied. Imagine if 150 people were given the chance to resettle in New Zealand. What that would mean, because I know what that means. I was rescued and I was given a home here in this country. And that has never been taken up. It pains me to think of that. So we have more than 200 people listening into this tonight. What can you do? What is the legacy of the Tampa? Well, it means bloody hell. 20 years on since the Tampa, there is an opportunity, a small opportunity for folks in Canberra to perhaps do the right thing. And what that means is to please approve, give those guys in Australia some permanent protection. These temporary visas are torture. Approve an emergency intake of Afghans from Afghanistan. And please sign that petition. It's on change.org. It's called Action for Afghanistan. And I hope and I pray that 20 years ago that we can bring about some change. But look, I haven't been to Australia. I can't speak for you guys, and I hate lecturing you guys, but that's my last word.
We'll see you here next week. Thank you.
David, just for interest, what do you think is the legacy of it all? Arguably, you know as much about Tampa as any of us, apart from Abbas. What do you think will be the consequence?
I think it's ruined our politics. It's soured the law. It's humiliated Australia, and it's tortured a large number of people. And it remains completely unresolved. Completely unresolved. The other night, Peter Dutton looked down the camera with his mournful eyes and said how careful we must be to take people who are desperately trying to get out from under the Taliban again from Afghanistan because of the dangerous people that might be there. And I thought to myself, yep, they're playing exactly the same politics of fear and exaggeration that they played 20 years ago. And look, we live, we get by. We're in many ways a civilized society, but Tampa corrupted us. We remain corrupted in my view. But gentlemen, Julian, Abbas, Beruz, thank you so much for a remarkable conversation. Thank you. And I'm handing back now to Azadeh. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.